22 October 1956. Vienna, 3rd District. A civil servant named Karl K. blots his fountain pen, signs a personnel form denying any complicity or active membership in National Socialist crimes, and copies a line into his notebook he would never say aloud. The world has decided we were Hitler's first victims. It would be ungrateful to argue. He leaves the office just before curfew. He folds the form into his leather portfolio. He walks past the tram stop at Radetzky Platz. He feels the old city knead itself into the new one by force of signatures, seals, promises. Those signatures carried more weight than he admitted. The arithmetic of paperwork had replaced the arithmetic of war. We must start earlier. 13. April 1945. Vienna falls. The Red Army plants flags over the shattered dome of the arsenal, then fans through the districts. Gunfire stops. Assault begins. In the city archive, an official typed "transportation" halted. In her diary, a woman on grosse Fahrgast wrote, "No bread, no husband." The Volksstimme printed a headline, "The rubble was the new landscape." The city had become a soil of brick and glass. Trümmerfrauen took to the mounds with shovels and carbide lamps, their palms split by bricks. They stood in chains, passing broken stones down to narrow-gauge carts. A municipal tally shows 1.8 million cubic meters cleared in the first year. The mathematics of rubble began with a shovel and ended with a ledger. Missing persons notices wallpapered doorways. Returned, last seen at Praterstern. Russisch Gefangen. Vermisst seit 44, Harkau. The city church posted lists. A patrolman's report noted, "A boy believed dead returned from Silesia. Family did not recognize him at first." There were letters that traveled months behind their writers. There were letters that never did. Occupation followed. Soviets in the east. Americans in Upper Austria and Salzburg. British in Styria and Carinthia. French in Tyrol and Vorarlberg. Vienna carved into sectors with an international district administered by the Allied Kommandatura. 4 flags for one city. 4 curfews. 4 bureaucracies peering into the rooms of one city. A U.S. Forces in Austria USFA Civil Affairs Summary for May 1945 observed, "Population appears dazed, dependent, displays little hostility to occupation. Fear centers on requisitioning and reprisals." A Soviet Army political report archived later in Moscow noted with satisfaction, "The Viennese are compliant." Neither report carried the sound in that first month. The dragging of furniture into stairwells, the dull clank of radiator pipes cut for scrap, the quiet negotiations between a butcher and a lieutenant over a hindquarter. Karl moved between streets as if they were past tenses. His unit had broken near Lake Balaton. He had walked home. He had left his uniform in a ditch outside Sopron. He wore a grey jacket now. He told himself he had been just a conscript. He told his sister he had kept his head down. There were many who told themselves the same thing. It would be years before he would write the line that compacted all of it into an alibi so small it could fit on a page. Fear of retribution hung over the city, a kind of weather. The Soviet zone tightened its grip. A Soviet field order demanded lists of party members and industrialists for arrest. A German-language notice in Favoriten commanded women to report to a labor detail. Another demanded the turning in of radios. Vienna police protocols logged rapes, looting, and fraternal incidents, euphemism for what could not be described. A British officer recorded in his notebook by the Sobieski barracks, "General behavior orderly, shortages acute, women clearing rubble, men invisible." The hunger winter came. It came more than once. 1945 to 46, 1946, 47. The first winter was shock. The second was calculation. Ration cards were the mathematics of survival. The standard ration dropped under 1,200 calories in the worst months. The Allied Commission for Austria's weekly report for February 1947 listed the caloric totals alongside weather notes, as if the one explained the other. Vienna, 1,075 calories. Heavy snow. UNRRO shipments crept open. American trucks unloaded sacks stamped with black stencils floor. POWWM elk. The sacks themselves became curtains. A school nurse in Otterkring wrote, "Children faint in class. Blue lips. The teacher keeps a sugar cube in her pocket." On the Naschmarkt, tobacco replaced money. American cigarettes became a unit of account. 1 lucky strike for a kilo of potatoes, 2 for a piece of soap, 5 for an old bicycle. The arithmetic was precise and impersonal. The city was a ledger. Black market. Schwarzmarkt. Everyone knew where it was. The law knew. The Allied patrols knew. The city knew that the legality of eating ended where prices began. The arrest files describe it in neutral language. Machine parts exchanged for foodstuffs. Unauthorized slaughter of pig. Possession of army property, to wit, 24 tins of condensed milk. But there were other papers that never met ink. A military policeman writes, though, "No arrests today." The woman had 2 children. Beneath the occupation reports, the human calculus persisted, not heroic, not demonic, routine. Mauthausen was 30 kilometers east of Linz, in the American zone. Its liberation produced images that would not be easily swallowed. U.S. Signal Corps film. Still photos of stacked bodies, a quarry, the frequently written caption KZ. Soldiers forced townspeople to walk past the camp to see what they had not seen. In Vienna, the newsreel ran weeks later. People watched. They turned away. They gasped. They muttered. A city clerk jotted after seeing the film in a darkened cinema on Mariahilfer-Straße, "Unspeakable, horrible, not our doing." A short entry. It was easier for a Viennese to believe it had not happened among them, but the stones of the quarry had built the city's bomb shelters. The arithmetic of concrete connected the camp to the city. Displaced persons were everywhere and nowhere. Jews from Poland and Hungary, forced laborers from Ukraine, Croatia, Italy, former prisoners of war. They lived in camps at Bindemichl, Wels, Bad Ischl. The DP camp near Ebensee, sheltered in former Wehrmacht huts, grew a bakery and a school. Allied intelligence summaries speak of DP morale, of repatriation rates. A Jewish DP council minutes describe the farewell song of a transport to Trieste. Outside the barbed wire, Viennese passed with ration bags. In a municipal office on the Rathausstrasse, a memo went out. DPs will receive rations according to Allied lists. The city is not responsible for their housing. The sentence arranged responsibility into a neat shape. It was not always so neat. Austrian gendarmes guarded DP convoys headed north to camps run by the American Joint Distribution Committee. They heard Yiddish and Ukrainian laughter in the trucks. They resented the food in the trucks. Then they waved the convoys through because there were orders. A woman in the 9th district wrote in a diary preserved at the Dokumentarschem Archiv des Österreichischen Widerstandes. "They say the Jews will go to Palestine. It is better. We cannot take care of everyone." The sentence lifted a burden by pushing it over a border. Many sentences that year did that work. Denazification began with questionnaires, milder forms with deadly implications. In Austria, it was named with the neatness of decrees, Verbotsgesetz. The Provisional Government's declaration of 27 April 1945 banned the NSDAP and its affiliates. The National Socialist Gesetz and the 1947 amendments formalized punishments. There were categories, procedures, deadlines. The mathematics of guilt took shape. The Volksgerichtshofe, people's courts, tried cases of treason and war crimes. The registration officers catalogued Parteimitglieder, SA-men, SS-men, NS-Frauenschaft. The files thickened. Karl filled a Meldebogen. He knew what to write. Mitläufer, follower, not enthusiastic. Obliged. He had attended meetings, paid dues. He had also joined the Wehrmacht. He did not mention the yard where he had watched men in civilian coats dig a trench near Venezia in 1942. He wrote instead that he had served as a clerk. He wrote that he had never harmed anyone directly. It was the most common sentence in the files. A trainee in the denazification office stamped forms for 3 months. She wrote a note home. Most are just men like father. They want to keep their jobs. The Volksgericht in Vienna convicted thousands, a number at once large and small. The Bundesministerium der Justiz would later calculate 13,000 convictions for Nazi crimes by the Austrian people's courts by the time they ceased. The number sits on the page like a finished sum. The denominator bleeds into the margin. There had been about 700,000 registered Nazis in Austria by 1945, more per capita than in the Reich. In 1938, Vienna had cheered louder than Munich. This also appears in documents. It appears on film. The arithmetic of guilt never fully closes. Officials reasoned that the state needed administrators more than it needed moral clarity. The Allied Control Commission files carry the logic. An American memo. Prosecution of lower-level party members will be counterproductive to stability. Suggest focus on major offenders. A Soviet report. Denazification insufficient. Bourgeois parties harbor fascist elements. The Austrian ministers nodded at the Americans. They feared the Soviets more. They also feared the emptiness of desks. Karl's superior interceded. He wrote a 1-paragraph reference. K was diligent. He did not propagate. He is needed. The Volksgericht spared him. It spared many of his kind. There was punishment. There were executions. There were cell doors that shut on men who had overseen deportations from the Aspangbahnhof. There were trials of Mulhausen guards. There were tears of widows whose husbands had not returned that seasoned any satisfaction with salt. There was also amnesty. In 1948, the National Rat passed an amnesty that restored rights to lesser offenders. The reason was stated simply: national reconciliation. The ex-Nazis were too many to exclude. They were voters the parties wanted. In an SPP strategy memo from 1949 preserved in the party archive, the line appears: "We must not yield the former National Socialists entirely to the VDU. They must be integrated." The VDU, the Federation of Independents, would later become the FPPPI. The memo describes them as a reservoir for one party or another depending on who makes the better offer. The arithmetic of coalition was relentless. In the Republic of Propose, the major parties divided posts like bread. Karl returned to a desk. He filed housing requests for the magistrate. The ledger became his weapon. He wrote onto index cards the dimensions of rooms that were not his. The city could house 3 families in a 2-room flat with a small kitchen. He learned a new arithmetic: meters, heads, nights. He sent a family from Bratislava, Volksdeutsch, into a shared flat in Meidling. He took a complaint from the original tenant. "They are strangers," he wrote. Complaint noted. In the margin he wrote, "No rooms." These words repeated on his page for years. There were others in his office. A woman whose husband had been arrested in 1944 for a joke about Hitler and disappeared at the Rousseauer Kaserne. A man who had been a party Kreisleiter's secretary and somehow remained a secretary. He smoked and called the Soviets thieves. There was a chief who kept a small wooden Madonna on his desk and whispered at 9 each morning. There were omnivorous silences. In such offices, the new state came into being. The first victim thesis grew into a shape that could be said aloud without too many consequences. It had origins in the Moscow Declaration of 1943. Austria, the first free country to fall a victim to Hitlerite aggression, it read, and in the next line it demanded Austrian responsibility for participation in war against the Allies. Most quoted the first clause, fewer the second. Karl knew the phrase. He admired the usefulness of its first half. He did not think about its second. In West Germany, Konrad Adenauer would speak of those led astray, of Christian foundations. He would push amnesties and the 131 a law to reinstate former officials. In Austria, Leopold Figl said, "I love freedom." Julius Raab spoke of Staatspolitik and national unity. Bruno Kreisky later would wink at a coalition with men whose pasts smelled of smoke and archives. The versions differed in accent and emphasis. In both places, the immediate imperative was to staff a state, feed a population, and hold a line against a new enemy, where West Germany would later develop a public ritual of reckoning. Auschwitz trials, student slogans, the president declaring 8 May a day of liberation. Austria set its memorial clock to 1938, to march, to flags in Heldenplatz, to the idea that a small country had been swallowed. It was true. It was not the whole truth. Karl's lightness grew with each year in which no one asked him for more details. He stopped telling the story of the trench near Venezia even to himself. He told instead the story of the day in 1947 when an American sergeant had stood in his office doorway and asked directly for a room for a Jewish lady. He remembered he had found that room. He forgot the rest. His notebook filled with numbers, quotes, lines he would not share. He was fond of a sentence he copied from a British occupation report. The Viennese are admirable for their economy of speech. He liked the idea that silence could be an economy. The economy itself began to stir. Marshall Plan shipments turned into machines. The U.S. Economic Cooperation Administration circulated posters showing wheat becoming metal, locomotives becoming jobs. In West Germany, Ludwig Erhard tore ration cards into confetti, loosed prices, and called it social market logic. In Austria, the Grand Coalition planned by dividing spoils. USIA, the Soviet Enterprise Administration, siphoned profits from oil and steel in the east, and the other 3 zones pumped money into factories in the west. The mathematics of aid was cold. The Americans published their inputs precisely: tons of grain, barrels of gasoline, miles of rails. They did not publish the moral accounting that went with it. They did not have to. The smell in Vienna changed. Coal smoke loosened its grip as oil arrived. Clothing grew less threadbare. A radio crackled with 2 voices, west too far, east too close, until the tones of neutral news found a middle register. Borek, a boy who had painted a small sign for his mother's seamstress shop in 1946, now rode a new bicycle by the Danube Canal. A city that had been extracted by force into states returned to itself by labor. On 15 May 1955, the Austrian State Treaty was signed in the Belvedere. Leopold Figl held up the paper like a child showing a drawing. "Österreich ist frei," he cried. The crowd roared. The newsreels caught tears, hats tossed, the sound of a country rewriting itself in an afternoon. The treaty demanded, again, that Austria ban the Nazi Party. It also removed the excuse of foreign occupation. Karl stood in a beer hall that day. He looked up at the screen. He smiled. He had known 3 flags on his street since he was a boy: red, white, red, swastika, the red banners with gold fringes of the Red Army. He liked the simplest one best. He wrote in his notebook, "Freedom feels like subtraction." Subtraction? Freedom from guilt? Freedom from inquiry? From 1955 onward, Austria declared neutrality in law. In October, the National Rat passed the constitutional law on neutrality. The country turned itself into a corridor, a polite room in which East and West could place their coats and speak softly. Onto this neutrality the victim preface settled like dust. If you are neutral now, surely you were neutral then. The sentence was a trick of tenses. The year after the treaty, the year of Karl's Line, 1956, Hungarian refugees flooded across the border at Andau and Nickelsdorf. The stream became a river. 180,000 crossed into Austria in weeks. The images are stark: boots in mud, children leaning over the sides of trucks, the red wax of passport stamps sealing into paper the direction of flight. Austria fed them. The Red Cross set up cots in school halls. The world praised Austria. The country cemented a new identity: humanitarian, careful, necessary. It was a good identity. It obscured an older one. That October day, when Karl signed his form and wrote his line, he had been supervising a small team allocating rooms to Hungarian families in a municipal school gym. He calculated the fairness of blankets. He admired the speed of the ledger. He did not think about whether he had been fair to a different category in a different year. His pen leapt a bridge he had no interest in seeing. The years went. The people's courts faded, finally closed. Amnesties widened. In 1957, then again tacitly in the 1960s with reinstatements and silent reintegration. A Bundeskanzler argued that we cannot have two classes of citizens forever. The argument traveled easily inside rooms lined with portraits of Habsburg emperors and in rooms lined with blank plaster. It fit a budgetary line item. It fit an electoral map. Restitution was a more stubborn calculation. Austria drafted Rückstellungsgesetze to return Aryanized property. The laws looked good in print. In practice, restitution moved like cold syrup. Claimants found files missing, neighbors hostile, managers unresponsive. A widow tried for years to reclaim a shop on the Gumpendorfer Straße her husband had legally lost under illegal circumstances. Missing invoice, read the file. Unclear title. The longer the file grew, the thinner the patience became. A municipal file reveals a note in 1952. Claimant emigrated to Tel Aviv. The case closed itself. The comparison with West Germany sharpened in the 1960s. Across the border, the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt forced television into courtrooms. In Vienna, some watched, many didn't. In West Germany, student protests shouted, "Unter den Talaren, Muff von 1000 Jahren," at professors with brown pasts. In Vienna, cafes filled with cigarette smoke watched the Prague Spring die, and intellectuals argued in other circles. In Bonn, President von Weizsäcker in 1985 said, "Wir dürfen den 8. Mai 1945 nicht vom Ende der Wörter her sehen, sondern vom Anfang der Freiheit." Day of Liberation. In Vienna, the commemorations stayed muted, repetitive, reliant on 1955 as beginning and 1938 as exculpation. A slow divergence began between two states founded in similar ruins. Yet the Austrian participation in Nazi crimes was not invisible. Not to everyone. Some refused the thick velvet of forgetting. Simon Wiesenthal sat in a small office in the Rothschild Spittal, tracking rumors, clipping reports, filing them. In documents you see the neatness of his pen. In politics you hear the anger at his insistence. Bruno Kreisky accused him of using mafia methods. Kreisky, the refugee returned, the Jew who became chancellor, made his arrangement with a party that needed formerly brown voters and did not mind the resume of a coalition partner too much. Friedrich Peter, former SS man, became a respectable leader in the new politics. Kreisky defended him. Morality and arithmetic clashed, and arithmetic clashed, and arithmetic won. In those years, Karl's children grew up. They learned to ski. They were taught little officially of the names Globoknik, Kaltenbrunner, Eichmann, Austrians who had organized death elsewhere and signed papers in Vienna. Their schoolbooks reduced the Nazi period to a few pages with images of bombs and crowds. A caption under a picture of women clearing rubble in 1945 said, "Austrians suffered greatly from the war. True, not sufficient." In Salzburg, a teacher cut a page from a new edition that mentioned an SS raid on Romani camps. In Lower Austria, a school inspector advised, "Stress Austrian resistance." The W archive contains a pamphlet from 1960 for school use, Widerstand in Österreich, 1938-45. The pamphlet is not wrong. It leaves the arithmetic incomplete. Children collect their past from the corners of rooms. Karl's son asked once, at 12, whether his father had been a soldier. Karl said yes. He said, "I stood guard." It ended there. A shorter sentence than the truth. Perhaps that is always what fathers do. Perhaps not. The black market died. Stores returned. The Naschmat settled back into food. Cigarettes became again something you smoked rather than traded for butter. The mathematics of calories became the mathematics of wages. Housing improved, though slowly. Karl retired. He took his pension to a cafe in the first district. He read the newspaper with men who had similar pensions and similar blanks. 1986 broke the surface. Kurt Waldheim ran for the presidency with a face that had smiled for the United Nations. He had been the world's diplomat. He had been Austria's global evidence of virtue. His wartime past, like many men's, had lines in it that were darker than his public post-war face. A small booklet, released by the World Jewish Congress and reporters, drew a line from Waldheim to Army Group E to the Balkans, to years in which deportations and reprisal killings occurred where he served as an intelligence officer. Waldheim said, "I did my duty." He said, "I did nothing wrong." He called the accusations lie. He leaned on the sentence everyone had leaned on. We were victims too. The election turned into a referendum on memory. The files became weapons in a campaign. The truths were difficult. Waldheim had not been a commander authorizing mass murder. He had served in a structure that had organized it. He had been present. He had known enough to be quiet. He had not written much in his own notebook. Others had written about him. Austria closed ranks. A majority voted for him. The international community sanctioned the symbol, if not the state. The Americans put him on a watch list. He could not enter the US. The Austrian government wore the ban as a wound and a badge. An old man in a cafe said to a reporter, "They want to punish us again." The vocabulary of 1945 returned and twisted itself around a man who had avoided the war's muddiest trenches. Karl watched the television. He loved the firm, reasoned voice of the anchor. He respected words like alleged and documented. He disliked words like complicity. He wrote in his notebook again, as if he needed the friction of pen and paper to anchor his thoughts. He is us, we are him, but I do not want to be him. In another line he wrote, "We are the first victims." But of whom exactly? It was the first time the question mark made it onto that page. Waldheim was not a confession. He was a mirror. In the mirror, it was possible for a nation to see itself as sinless or as hopeless, depending on where you stood. The most honest held two images together and refused to let either one push the other away. The election did not punish past crimes. It measured the present appetite for discomfort. The result was precise. West of the river, students marched for different reasons now. They protested nuclear power. They protested taxes. They protested this and that. Only some carried signs that read, Vergangenheitsbewältigung jetzt. There were writers who had never left. Ingeborg Bachmann and Thomas Bernhard had already launched their assaults on the Austrian amnesia when they could. Their sentences were knives. Bernhard had called Austria a nation of 6.5 million idiots, which was slanderous and helpful both if you were trying to wake a room. He dragged family dramas onto stages that looked like parlors. He forced his audience to sit through the long untangling of the unsaid. Not many wanted to hear it twice. In 1988, the Goldhagen storm in Germany was still years off. The debate's Austrian version took quieter angles. It threaded through benches in parks where old men played chess. It slipped into Sunday television. It made welfare offices deny, then grant, then deny again, claims from victims who had become claimants too late. The National Fund for Victims of National Socialism, created later in 1995, would attempt to fill the gap. It would dress an old wound with new gauze. The first victim myth frayed and remained. In the files, one finds arid evidence for moral weather. A 1987 opinion poll asked, "Do you accept that many Austrians were involved in the atrocities of the Nazi era?" A majority said yes. A plurality also agreed that Austrians had been the first victims. Contradiction did not bother the respondents. In Austrian politics, contradiction is a neighbor, not an enemy. The mathematics of memory allows sums to be inconsistent and still claimed as cohesive. Add 1 for suffering. Add 1 for complicity. Insist the total is still 1. Karl aged. He left the city's heartbeat for smaller districts. He began to take walks on the Donauinsel, a strip of engineered land built for flood control and weekend leisure. He carried his notebook because habit is a shelter. He read the newspapers. He found a small article in 1991 about a man arrested in Carinthia for Wiederbetätigung, Nazi re-engagement. The party was banned, the symbol supervised by law, the repetition policed. The article shared a page with news about the Socialist Party rebranding to the Social Democratic Party and a football match. The old and the new printed together. A young clerk in the magistrate discovered in 1992 a file from 1946 misfiled behind water records. It contained a list of names, addresses, dates, the docket numbers of denazification cases. She put it in a folder marked historical. She showed it to a professor who had come to look for exactly such things. He copied it. He published a paper. The city shrugged. Files often surfaced. Days after, the file fell back into a cabinet. The work of recovery never quite got ahead of the work of forgetting, because forgetting was cheaper, and forgetting made the room warmer. There was no summary. There were only specific cases, short quotes, decisions made in rooms that smelled of onion soup, of cologne, of tobacco, occupation reports, denazification files, Allied intelligence summaries, Austrian state archives boxes with string around them, handwriting on onion skin, memoirs that remembered only some things and changed the order of others to reduce the burden of weather. The living carried their pages through the decades. An elderly woman in the 7th District received a letter in 1996 from a law office in New York asking if she would agree to a settlement regarding dormant accounts. She had never left Austria. She had never had an account. Her husband's brother had. His name was on a list. She wrote back, "I do not know." She placed the letter in a drawer with her marriage certificate and her children's baptism papers. She put them there because those were the documents you needed to open doors in this country. You did not need the letter. You did not need the stubborn afterlife of numbers. Karl died in 1999. He had written fewer lines each year. The last page of the last notebook carries 2 known quotes. The first, copied in a careful hand, is from a 1985 speech by the German president, the day of liberation. He had circled liberation. He had not underlined it. The second is his own, first written in 1956, written now with a reservation. The world decided we were Hitler's first victims. It would be ungrateful to argue. Then, in smaller letters beneath, ungrateful. Or, finally, honest. What remains? The narrative of Austrian innocence survived long because it was useful, and because it was not wholly false. It was never wholly true. The participation in crimes was heavy, enthusiastic at times, strategic often, resigned also, a spectrum of human conduct. Names of Austrian perpetrators appear like stains. Names of Austrian rescuers, resistors, appear like sparks. Between them, the majority navigated with an internal compass that pointed toward the next meal, the next paper signed, the next election won, without relitigating the previous regime. The mathematics of guilt never balances. It is not a ledger, but a weather map, a shifting set of pressures. The mathematics of food stops once shelves fill. The mathematics of rooms ceases when new housing opens. The mathematics of the Cold War dissolves when the wall goes down. The mathematics of memory persists because it is not about counting. It is about living with piles of uncounted things. Austrian divergence from West Germany in memory politics can be tallied in public gestures. The Weizsäcker speech versus the silence of Austrian presidents before and after. The Frankfurt trials versus the quiet Austrian cases. The student movement's focus on Auschwitz in the West, and the Austrian left's focus on neutrality, social partnership, prosperity. The Waldheim affair's national response, defensiveness turned identity. The creation of UNO City in Vienna, a physical symbol of this neutral, humanitarian self. Everything is counted, not everything is subtracted. One sometimes wants an ending, a line that closes like a door. There is no such line here. There is only a man's notebook and a city's files. There is a sentence you could not speak in 1956 that remains dangerous because it is convenient. There is a ledger of rooms assigned in 1947 that still counts in generations who grew up in those rooms and learned, in schoolbooks and hallways, what not to ask. 22 October 1956. The ink dried on his denial. He did his sums with the state's tacit approval for decades. When his children asked if they should be proud, he told them to be proud that they were Austrian, a neutral country, a good host to the suffering of others, a place that managed its past as it managed its traffic, with lights, signals, rules, and wide avenues along which you could move without thinking too much about what the stones beneath your shoes had once been. There are worse ways to live. There are also better ones. The last pages in the archive show that. Not because they are full of confessions, because they are full of receipts, of electricity and gas, of rent paid by families with names that did not appear in the phone book before the war because they had lived across a border then, of funeral costs, the documents of a country that decided to keep going rather than look back. The staples turn brown, the paper thins, the names fade. The arithmetic of memory, it turns out, depends on who is doing the counting. In one of the Allied summaries for Vienna in January 1946, a line reads, almost as an afterthought, morale stable, hunger intensifying, cold severe, an economy of words. The city would become expert at that economy. The civil servant who copied his line in 1956 understood economies. He was good at them. He learned in time that the front line after 1945 ran through his memory and his paperwork, not across a battlefield.